On behalf of Deccan Herald, I welcome you all to the first edition of Spotlight, a fresh series of debates and discussions to better understand and interpret our world. We have an esteemed panel today to discuss the rise of right-wing politics across the United States, where Mr. Donald Trump won the most widely followed presidential elections in 2016. As he commences his term as the 45th President of the United States this month, we take a bird's eye view of what it entails for us and the world at large. I would like to take the opportunity to thank Columbia University, Columbia Journalism School, and Columbia Alumni Association for helping us putting this event together. We have with us today Phyllis Fang Savage. She's an alumna of the Journalism School and has been the head of Columbia Alumni Association India chapter. I would request Phyllis to please come on stage and say a few words about the university.
Thank you, Piali. And I think on behalf of everybody at Columbia, the Columbia family, we're especially grateful to Nickel Conical and the Deccan Herald for hosting the event this evening. And of course, a warm welcome to everyone who's here this evening, and a special warm welcome to Dean Steve Coll and many of the alumni here in the crowd. It's always great to have Dean Coll back in India, and this makes it 2 years in a row, which really says a lot about Columbia's commitment to India, especially from the journalism school. Among the international students at the journalism school, Indian students continue to be the largest group of students, and I know this is a trend that the journalism school really wants to continue in the years to come. Not surprisingly, Indian students have traditionally delivered some of the best work that we're seeing at the journalism school in New York, and we do hope that many of the journalists do come back to India and start making an impact here as well. And on to this evening, I just want to say, I think it's probably fair to say that regardless of your political leanings, whichever way you believe, the next 4 years at the White House under a Trump presidency are definitely going to be interesting and exciting. But as my husband reminded me this morning, it's not only going to be that, because it could be a nerve-wracking 8 years to come. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to B.S. Arun, a senior editor at the Deccan Herald, who has been with the paper for over 20 years. Before moving to Bangalore, he was the paper's chief bureau and political editor in Delhi, and I'm really looking forward to Arun's expertise in geopolitics and perspective as the moderator for the talk this evening. Mr. Arun?
Thank you, and a warm welcome to all of you. I would like to introduce our two main speakers here this evening. Mr. Steve Coll is a staff writer in the New Yorker, and he has won not one, but 2 Pulitzer Prizes, something that's not many in the world have achieved. Steve had worked in Washington Post, and also he was the India correspondent of the paper, and then for many years, he has been working in the New Yorker, and he's a recipient of several big awards, not just in the United States, but across the world. Our another speaker is Nitin Pai, co-founder and director of Takshashila Institution, which is a think tank based out of Bangalore. Nitin has worked for many years in Singapore, and he brings out Pragati, the Indian National Interest Review, and has published several of the edited volumes. He has taught civilian and military leaders at India's College of Defense Management, the Army War College, and Brunei's Institute of Strategic Studies. I welcome both Nitin and Steve on the stage. Thank you. So we will begin our conversation, and as you know, the topic is how Trump won and what this means for geopolitics. Let me start with Nitin. Nitin, I think the matter of interest for the audience here is Trump's victory and its implications on the IT industry here in India, especially Bangalore. Mainly because outsourcing, if you go by Trump's some of the rhetorics during the election campaign, it may be of some concern, which many have expressed, not just in the IT sector, but even outside. How do you view this?
Thanks, Arun. Thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. What I'll do is I'll pick out 5 points from the second part of the topic today, what it means for geopolitics, and then try and answer the question, bring it down to what it means to the IT industry in Bangalore. First of all, I think for the first time, the bases of US global leadership are uncertain. During the Obama campaign 8 years ago, there was a story of US decline. And I used to challenge the story of US decline, which is quite popular in Delhi, which is used as an argument for India to align with China. I used to challenge that by saying that there are 2 reasons why the US will be number 1 for a long period of time. One is because it's a resilient democracy. It makes mistakes and it recovers from them. It has the ability to recover from those mistakes. And second, it's a magnet for the most talented people in the world. So no smart person in the world wants to, the first destination for the smartest people in the world is still the United States. So as long as you have these 2 factors, the US will be number 1 for a long period of time. From what I understand from Trump's rhetoric and the popular force which propelled him into the White House, I think for the first time I could say that these 2 factors of US leadership are uncertain. By uncertain, what I mean is we don't know what the probability is. We don't know how it will pan out. We're just uncertain. Second, because of this uncertainty, most countries of the world will tend to take a protectionist path. So we're looking at the next few years of, at least in the short term, of countries building walls, building fences, metaphorical and physical, and requiring passports and controls for the movement of people, of ideas, of capital, of goods and services. Which means for us in India, for the first time since 1991, the factors which propelled our growth, which gave us the modern India, so to speak, post-91 India, will come under a cloud. We won't enjoy the kind of a benign external environment which encouraged movement of people, which encouraged movement of capital, which encouraged movement of ideas for the last 20-25 years. And that's come under a cloud. Just at a time when we thought we would be able to, continue to sustain 8% growth for a long period of time. It's affected China in a similar way because China too relies on the same external framework for its success. But the impact on China will be a lot easier for the Chinese to manage because they started earlier and they had a long run of sustained economic growth. So they're in a better position to manage the uncertainties of this world where there are walls and controls on borders. For us, it's a threat. So what that means is, if we have to generate 8% growth or more for a sustained period of time, we've got to find other mechanisms to do so. One is domestic. Will we be able to integrate the Indian domestic economy fast enough to be able to generate 8% growth until the world comes around to understanding that open borders are important? Second, will we be able to create bilateral partnerships with countries that matter, which will allow us to have the same kind of the luxury of open borders? Third, will we be able to create alternative multilateral partnerships, if not with the United States, if not with the West, with with Southeast Asia and East Asia, with China, with Europe, with Africa and South America. So the challenges to generate 8% growth have just become a lot harder. In that, I would even bring in the idea of what happens to our IT industry. Is that in one way, it's bad for some IT companies, which rely on a particular business model which requires visas to be given, but it might not necessarily be necessarily bad for IT, because if that job is not based in Boston, it can be based in Bangalore. And if it's based in Bangalore, the smart people stay here, they pay local taxes, they use public services, they create demand for better governance and so forth. So there is a bright side to the Indian IT industry, but not necessarily for Indian IT companies. Now let's just go on from domestic to the geopolitical. This is my fourth point. It's become all the more important for India to be the swing power, which swings deftly and dexterously between the United States and China. For a long time, we've made this argument that it makes no sense for us to choose China or the United States when we can have both. You could align with the US where your interests lie with the US. You can align with the China on issues like trade, on environment, and others where your interests lie with the Chinese. So to be able to sustain being a swing power in order to get our way through the international system, I think it's important to remember the two criteria what you need to do. Right? One is you must have better relations with the United States and China than they have with each other. So if Trump comes along, and if Trump does not enjoy great relations with China, that's an opportunity for India to have better relations with the United States and with China. And I think we are well placed to do that. So we should hope that things go bad between the United States and China. We should encourage Mr. Trump to pick some fights with Xi Jinping and the others, if that is at all possible. The second is takes the view of Trump being this transactional guy. There's very little people know about what President Trump will do, but a lot of people think that Mr. Trump is a deal maker, he's a transactional guy, most of his relationships will be transactional. That plays very well to the swing power thesis as well, because you should be in a position to inflict pain or deliver pleasure to the United States and China. As long as they're able to inflict pain or deliver pleasure to these parties, they want to have, they think you're important and your value in their geopolitics improves. So how do we go about doing that? Right? In India, it's extremely difficult to be deft and dexterous, especially in foreign policy, because each move is challenged. There is a lot of hand-wringing. There are still people in New Delhi who wonder whether it was a good idea to abandon the Soviet Union and have this nuclear deal with the United States. There are still people who think that it would have been a wonderful thing for the Soviet Union to continue and survive, and what could we do to handle the collapse of the Soviet Union in 2017. So that's a challenge. The last point I want to make before I hand it over is it's slightly mischievous. It goes with this point that if the West is tired of democracy, if the West is tired of liberalism, if the West is tired of championing free markets, maybe they should just make way for people who have the energy to champion these things. So if India is prepared to embrace democracy, liberalism, markets, globalization, maybe it should stake its claim for global leadership around these values. Then you look at the United Nations Security Council and say, why do we need 4 Putins or 5 Putins saying the same thing in the United Nations Security Council? Maybe one of them has to step aside and let us in, right? And the claim we make is not because we are this great democracy with forms in triplicate saying that please let us in. But you say that, look, you guys are saying the same thing. All of you are illiberal Putins, right? So why do you need 4 Putins or 5? You just let us in. So of course that means that our own leader can't be a Putin, but I think that's not so difficult to manage. Thank you.
Thanks, Nitin, for that overall assessment of the impact of Donald Trump's victory on India and especially the IT sector. Steve is one who has seen the US elections from close quarters and reporting on most of the issues that connected with the US elections. Now, I would like to request Steve to have make some initial remarks on this issue, on both the issues of his victory as well as his impact on geopolitics.
Sure. Well, I really enjoyed that. And I like the last point. There's a question of who decides. Watched lots of talking heads explain this. It's a complicated subject, and I don't want to go into too much local detail, but I'll try to summarize what I think, and then talk a little bit about Trump and the world, and then maybe we can kick it back and forth a little bit. Of course, you all got to know our wonderful electoral college from abroad. Clinton won the popular vote by 4 million or so, a very substantial margin, but lost the electoral college essentially because of 100,000 votes in 3 states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And when you drill down into the counties that ended up creating that shock to the Clinton campaign plan, there's no real simple explanation. Racial backlash, clearly a factor that I want to talk about briefly, but before you give in to the cliches of the white working class backlash, you have to recognize that the counties that gave the election to Trump voted for Obama twice by margins of 7 or 8 points, and then they turned around and voted for Trump by margins of 20 points. So these were white majority working class counties that elected President Obama and then decided that they were done with the Democratic Party and willing to take a chance with Trump. I don't think it's an accident that you had a kind of white backlash vote after the first African-American president. I think those two things are related, and American racial history is full of 1 step forward, 2 steps back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And there was clearly a narrative about race, inclusion, and opportunity that was playing in these stressed white communities facing opioid addiction, flattening household incomes, and a sense that everyone was getting privileges except them. That clearly had a dimension and intensity that was related to the success that they supported, that they understood of the Obama presidency. It was also a backlash against globalization, of course. That's real. And it was manifest in another factor, which was how Mrs. Clinton, Secretary Clinton, represented globalization. I mean, at the beginning of the Democratic primary fight with Bernie Sanders, there's a ritual in the run-up to the Iowa caucuses, the first kickoff primary. Starts this previous summer with the Iowa State Fair. Well, Mrs. Clinton flew to the Iowa State Fair in a jet from Martha's Vineyard, walked around the fair, ate a corn dog, got back on her jet, and went back to Martha's Vineyard. Now, the American people are not dumb. They know that this elite is real and that it has that it lacks the kind of self-reflection and sense of urgency about their problems and their dilemmas that they want, that they require from their national leadership. I think Mrs. Clinton would have been a great president. She was super qualified, very well prepared. She was a natural for the office. She did not run a great campaign, however. She never found a message that really spoke about an agenda. Trump had an agenda. It was an ugly agenda in a lot of ways, at least rhetorically, but she was never really able to create a message that allowed people to visualize what kind of change would take place under her presidency. They made technical mistakes in the campaign. They overinterpreted the Obama coalition. They thought that the majority-minority America had arrived because of rising participation by Hispanic voters, and they thought that the youth vote and the core Obama constituency was just a statistical ability, and that just turned out to be wrong. They just became hubristic about the data. In fact, the white vote that mobilized with great energy, almost comparable to the youth vote during the Obama wins, and the Clinton campaign just didn't see that coming. In their defense, they say, okay, you're right, we got ambushed in Michigan and Wisconsin, but we did everything we possibly could to win in Pennsylvania because we knew that was a swing state, and we still lost. So maybe it was just, it was a change election. She was not a change candidate, and so they were structurally in a difficult position. Now, you can't, though, go through this list without mentioning the intervention of the FBI director in the last week. And Mrs. Clinton will go to her grave believing that if Comey had not written that unjustifiable, truly unjustifiable letter on the basis of virtually no information on the Friday, 10 days before the campaign, that she would be president, because their internal polling all collapsed after that letter was written. Now, that has the benefit of hindsight. It's very hard to prove, but that's certainly what they believe. The Russian intervention, it happened. It's a really important event in American national life. Did it really cause a change in the outcome of the election? I don't think you could really demonstrate that very easily. It certainly correlates with Trump's victory, so you can take that for what it's worth. Probably the most important part of the Russian intervention was not the hacked Podesta emails, in my opinion, but it was the trolling and the fake news manufacture and the building of a kind of ideological social media shared narrative about the Clinton candidacy that corresponded with changes in the way people consume news and information and living inside their filter bubbles. You all heard the story of the fake news story that was shared on the morning of the election, had 1 million shares that said the Pope had endorsed Donald Trump. And 2 hours later, when someone put out a corrective, that was shared only by 30,000 times. And the wave of this kind of manufacture, some of it for commercial purposes, some of it ideological and very deliberate, I think was a factor. So then to the second point, really quickly about Trump and the world. I think you're right. It's very hard to know what he believes. I mean, he's a narcissist, he's an opportunist, he's a very successful, very intuitive entertainer. He ran a really hardcore populist campaign without having much of a history as a populist. But he understood where the opportunity was, and he drove into it. He was very consistent, disciplined, aggressive, and that I expect will continue. There is one conviction that is on the record that is clearly deeply held, and that is that he sees trade, world trade, as a zero-sum game, and that he sees himself as someone who can win that game. And I think that will have consequences in the kinds of risks that he takes as president, because this is something he's been writing about, talking about for 20 years. He's almost only talked about it during the campaign in reference to manufacturing, because the free movement of labor is something that his organization has exploited quite a lot. And so I'm not sure how this one true conviction that he has will play out in the services side. I think on the manufacturing side, it's clearly going to be the theme of his first couple of years. Now, he has another dilemma to manage as he figures out what kind of place he wants to take in the world as president, and that is that he is the leader of a party that didn't want him. He essentially created a hostile takeover of the Republican Party, and his views about the world and the views of mainstream, even conservative Republicans are really quite different, Russia being the prime example. And how he's going to resolve that, what he really cares about, what he's willing to give to the party, what he wants for himself, what advice he takes, another source of uncertainty. Finally, I think in the National Security Cabinet he's appointed, in the Foreign Policy Cabinet, he's appointed a mixed group. He has a national security advisor, former lieutenant general involved in intelligence operations in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, who has been quite erratic in the things that he's been saying publicly, and he had a stint running the Defense Intelligence Agency, a very big organization at the Pentagon, and he was essentially fired by the Obama administration because he was just too elbows out, too much of a maverick, not able to manage the responsibilities of that job. Now he's next to the president in the White House as the national security advisor. That's a source of concern. On the other hand, the two appointments that he's made to the Pentagon and the State Department, even though in the case of Rex Tillerson, the chief executive of Exxon, it's a highly unconventional appointment. When you look at those two appointments, James Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, and Tillerson, those are both realists in the classical American tradition. They're managers of stability. They don't have some grand change agenda. Their history is working with all kinds of governments, including dictatorial governments, either to make the world safe for oil and gas production in the case of Exxon, or in the case of Mattis, a Marine general who fought in Iraq and Afghanistan, and basically a lot of his career has been in Europe and the Middle East. He's all about stability, all about alliances, and quite skeptical of Russia in my experience of him. So I don't think that Donald Trump has enough of a grounding in the schools of American foreign policy and the subtleties of different camps and so forth to have said, well, I want to choose these guys because they're realists and because they'll counterbalance my crazy tweets. But that's what he's done. He's appointed a couple of pretty strong characters who are not going to, who would, I assume, have the integrity to stand up to him and who are basically oriented towards stability. But he's also created a circle around him that is just ripe for conflict. I mean, this is not a team of rivals. This looks like a team of, sort of UFC cage match fighters. So I don't know what to expect as that struggle plays out, which he seems to encourage that sort of thing in his business operations.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Steve, one issue which may interest some of we journalists and some of the journalists here is that like we fail in India, there's some newspapers in the United States also fail in forecasting the result, where the actual results came, and they were dumbfounded. Papers like New York Times or Washington Post, they were off the mark. Why was it so? Or were the newspapers really against him, or the surveys or the studies showed in a different manner?
Well, two different questions, both good ones. On the failure of prediction, a really important moment for American journalism, I think. There were two factors. There was a hubris and a bubble around data science and prediction science in journalism that was exposed by this failure. And then there was also a loss of traditional reporting methods because of the downsizing of American newspaper newsrooms over the last 7 or 8 years. Used to be at the Washington Post, I know, beware a journalist saying back in the good old days, but when we had big, large newsrooms, which fortunately the Post again does have under Bezos, the ritual before an election was you would look at the swing states, the Michigans and the Ohios and the Pennsylvanias, and you'd take a look at the polling, but mostly you'd look at past elections and say which counties really matter, where is the swing in this election, and then you would send reporters out for weeks, and they would just knock on doors and talk to people, and then they would collect all of their impressions and voices into a big piece that didn't predict the result, but it basically gave you a pretty reliable flavor of who was energized, what was happening on the ground, what issues mattered. You go back and you look at those big traditional door-knocking reporting pieces, they hold up pretty well. What happened here was that there was a belief that the application of statistical methodology to polls would produce reliable predictions. And in the absence of a commitment to that street reporting, these sort of statistical data-based forecasts ended up being the political journalism of the cycle. They substituted, they got everyone's attention. And the predictions of Clinton's victory range from 99% in some cases to 70% was skeptical. Why were they so bad? the fault because you don't know how prediction works. We were talking about this morning. If you wake up in the morning and you look at whatever weather forecast you rely on, and it says there's a 70% chance of rain, you take your umbrella, you go outside, go through the day, it doesn't rain. You don't come home and rage at somebody about getting the rain prediction wrong because you know that predictions are predictions. They're complex weather systems, sometimes the rain doesn't come together. So the statisticians say, you just don't know how to read our predictions. We said it was 70%. We didn't say that means there's not a 30% chance you could lose. But the problem was that their models were also flawed, and they were flawed because they were based on polls. And polling in the United States is a social science in crisis because of changes in public attitudes towards being questioned about these things, the rise of cell phones and other factors. So the models were also garbage in, garbage out was a lot of what happened.
Let me just jump in there. This is just to disturb some of you journalists and psephologists. Because I think this business of electoral analysis, psephology as it's called in India, is just glorified gossip, right? And it is inferior to mere gossip, because mere gossip gives you fairly good indication of what's happening. Glorified gossip doesn't, right? So I think the I mean, it's entertainment. It's great entertainment. Right? Psephology is great entertainment. But it's not a science. And I think a lot of people in India at least come to grief because they believe a lot of psephology. Politicians believe in psephology. As a policy analyst, I look at it differently, right? It's always better to prepare to manage the consequences of whatever happens, rather than try and make a bet and try and win that bet. So a lot of the psephologists get into the trap of trying to make this bet, and then they get very excited about their own predictions. And in India, I think now a lot of people have begun to game this. There are second-order effects, because if a poll tells you that Arun is going to win an election, a lot of other people will start believing that Arun is likely to win an election. And the second poll which comes along will reinforce that, right? And Arun might have no chance at all to win an election, but the poll sort of creates a momentum. Arun begins to believe in it, Arun's opposition begins to believe in it, and then you come out with an election with an entirely different set of results. So I think it's important to, as Steve pointed out, I think he went down into great amount of detail to show how there is a sort of arrogance of modelers and models, and how we just don't know how people will behave over, at least in India, 400 million people, how would they behave on an aggregate basis?
Yeah, we'll come back to you after a few minutes. There will be questions for the audience also. There will be questions from the audience after some time. Well, Nitin, you pointed out earlier about the IT sector. There is one thing here. Donald Trump had been speaking against outsourcing and its America First policy and all that. But then the president is different from the president-elect or the candidate for the presidency. Now, we have seen it in the case of Obama. Again, the outsourcing issue, or Guantanamo Bay issue, or his statements saying that America will pull out troops from different countries. So in all this, he could not achieve what he had said. Now, it may happen, the same may happen relating to IT also. Don't you think so?
Well, it can, but in the case of Trump, Steve probably will be able to answer this a lot better than I do. But in the case of Trump, I don't think it's, in the particular situation of Trump and the Republican Party now, I don't think it's the case. If Trump wants to do something, the Republican Party in Congress is not going to stand in its way, in his way. And even if the actions against outsourcing or movement of visas for advanced, what do you call, high-skilled services to be based in the US, even if he doesn't put a sort of a hard wall on it, they can tighten the screws. And I think the likelihood of them tightening the screws in creating additional hurdles, maybe financial hurdles, maybe other non-financial hurdles in order to make this happen, it's a high likelihood, because it's the easiest thing to do. It's easier to do this than to build a wall on the border with Mexico. Right? In the wall, you've got to build a physical wall. This is a stroke of the pen. And I don't think the Republicans in Congress will stand in its way. But Steve probably knows this better than I do. Steve?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think you're analyzing it the right way. I just don't, I'm not, here's the politics of his anti-immigration rhetoric, he's not going to back off of. But those politics are located in the wall, and they're located in his Islamophobia and his baiting of Muslims and conflating the terrorist threat with Muslim immigration. He's made two promises to the American people. I assume he means what he says. One is that he's going to build the wall. He's already said, yes, and Mexico will pay for it later, but I'm not going to wait to negotiate that. So he's going to make some visible move in that direction. And then when his new regime gets in at Homeland Security, I'm sure they will follow through on his idea that there will be extreme vetting of folks coming from high-risk countries. Now, how that plays out, how it's defined, and how that gets reconciled with the demands of business for access to high-skilled labor is the question. Last thing is, remember, Congress is supine. The Republican Party has given itself over to him, but the Republican Party has been carrying the views of Silicon Valley and other businesses for a long time that they want more access to high-skilled immigrants, not less. And the party has been on the verge of grand bargain immigration bills twice in recent years that would have even loosened the screws on high-skilled migration in the United States. There's a consensus in both parties that this is a good thing. The reason those bills fell apart was just partisan politics, because neither party was ready to give the other credit for its participation in the victory. There's an opportunity now to combine Trump's America First racist tinge, nativism, and wall building with a more business-friendly immigration regime. So I think there's any number of outcomes that could flow out of this over the next year or two.
Yeah, and do you think, going by the past experiences, that candidate who stood for president and the president-elect or the president, they're different? Their issues, their policies may change once they become the president. Being the establishment is different from a campaigner for presidency.
I mean, you saw that with President Obama. He was obviously, had the right temperament for the job, and he turned out to be a successful president, but he was not terribly experienced. He'd been in the Senate for a few years. He'd never run a large organization. And so, yes, there was a big difference between his campaign on change and then his very practical presidency. I mean, now he was a student of the presidency and very sober and responsible, got into office, tried to figure out how things worked, and that led him towards a certain kind of realism that disappointed a lot of his enthusiasts. But in Trump, you have a different equation. You have someone who's also not very experienced, but doesn't bring with him a lifetime of convictions about public life the way Obama did. And so he does want to be liked. That's another enduring feature of his life. He really wants to be liked. And so, and he's a New Yorker. 75% of his neighbors voted against him. I mean, when he went to the polls, he was booed that morning in New York City. And yet he's friends with the New York establishment, which is mostly Democratic, and Chuck Schumer, who will now play an important role in the Senate. I mean, it's not out of the question that by the time he's done, he will have abandoned the Republican Party and done a takeover of the Democratic Party. I mean, it's
yeah, but I just want to come in with some insight. The election, Trump's election campaign created this cottage industry of academics who are moving into explaining populism. There's a lot of democracy skepticism, studies of populism, and etc. out there. But one of the best studies I've seen is this small little book called What is Populism by an academic called Jan Werner Muller. And Muller does not have a very sanguine view of the future. What he says is that it's possible, no, it's not possible. He says populists will rule as populists. In other words, what you see is what you get. So it's this, it's not that they are selling you a false prospectus like good politicians, right? Good politicians sell you a false prospectus, and then once they are in power, they do something else. But these guys are the kind of guys who will go into power saying that they'll do something, and they'll do exactly what they said. I would not rule out the possibility of Trump doing a lot of things that he said. He might not really believe in it, but since these are the things which got him elected, and he sort of gets the feedback from his core audience and his core voter base, he might just do that. So I don't think we should rule that possibility out.
Yeah, Steve, Nitin mentioned about the populist rule. Now we have seen, and this is a matter of concern for many, that the rightist forces are up and are in the government in many countries, whether it's Asia or Europe or now in the US. In Asia, we have India or Philippines. In Europe, you have Turkey, Erdogan coming back to power. The Brexit vote, even that I feel is a rightist vote. And now the US. Do you think it's a matter of concern, or where it will lead to?
I do think it's a matter of concern. I mean, I think it's, Trump is a trailing indicator of a worldwide trend. He wasn't, his election is a shock to many people. Certainly I didn't expect it. But after Brexit, it was evident that there was something afoot in reaction to globalization, in reaction to transnational sovereignty, in reaction to migration, in reaction to lots of forces of modernization, really, in the United States, that was bigger than in the past. You know, in the United States, we've had a history of populism leading to Trump. We just never had a president elected on that agenda. But really going all the way back to the late 19th century and through the civil rights movement when George Wallace ran for president, you go back and look at Wallace's campaign in 1968 and again in 72, his rhetoric of the forgotten man, of his rhetoric of white backlash, you know, as a colleague at Columbia says, Jelani Cobb, you know, it used to be that this kind of racist signaling to white voters was known as the dog whistle. You talked about welfare or crime. What you were really talking about was race. And somehow Trump took that inheritance, and as Jelani says, he went from dog whistle to bullhorn. And but this was a model for how to win American elections that has been around for a long time, and it was the Republican Party, Nixon and others, who created the Southern strategy, took the Republican Party from the party of civil rights, from the party of Lincoln, from the party of the Northeast, and to a party of the Deep South. It used to be the Democrats that owned the Deep South, now it's the Republicans. And so it looked for a long time, as recently as 2012, the Republican Party thought that they had painted themselves into a demographic corner because they had narrowed their appeal to essentially white voters who were anxious about the new America, and that Obama and the Democratic Party represented the successful strategy for the next 50 years. In fact, Donald Trump's chief of staff, Priebus, wrote a postmortem after 2012 telling the Republican Party, you've got to reach out to women, you've got to reach out to Hispanics, or you're dead. And then, now he's serving Trump, who did none of those things, and is president of the United States. So this populism is a part of the fabric of our country, just as your populism is a part of the fabric of, you know, Indian national identity and experience since independence. But there is something transnational about this movement. Some of it is sinister. You look at the fake news and the Breitbart right-wing manufacturing and organizing online in digital spaces. That is a very self-conscious and purposeful attempt to elect leaders. Some of it is geopolitical. Putin's ambitions are real to disrupt these orders and to get under the skin of Western Europe and the United States, and he's certainly gotten good results. But some of it is about disillusionment with the promises of liberalism, and that disillusionment is rooted in real experience.
Steve, I would like to throw light on one more issue before we open the floor to questions from the audiences. What I feel is now that Trump is going to take over, going by some of his utterances, there is a feeling that we may be seeing a change in the global order. His likely engagements engagement with Russia, his pronouncements are giving an indication that there may be a new axis emerging between the United States and Russia. So how do you see this, as well as the United States relations with China? Now, going by his again remarks, the relationship between China and United States is not going to be smooth. But at the same time, you have Russia and China. They are very close friends. So how do you see this axis coming and its impact on China?
Well, here Trump's relationship with the Republican Party is probably the most, it's one of the most problematical aspects of his relationship with the party leadership in the Senate, John McCain, Lindsey Graham, lots of Republican members of Congress disagree with the president about his attitude towards Russia, his failure to criticize Putin for the annexation of Crimea, the loose talk about lifting sanctions and so forth. So I think he will have a hard time bringing the party along if he wants to pursue some radical reformation of relations with Russia. In any event, even if he wants to pursue something truly in the nature of a departure in U.S.-Russia relations, I don't think it's achievable. I don't think that Putin would offer terms that would be acceptable to the Republican Party in any realistic sense. There might be a year of grand illusions about what's possible. Bush went through that. Remember, he said he saw into Putin's soul and was going to reset relations. Obama said he was going to reset relations. But relations are the way they are because of structure and because of Putin's strategy for Russia's place in the world as a weak great power. And I think you're right, he's not going to give up his relationship with China. And there's really not much in his relationship with the United States that is achievable, I think. So I imagine that there will be a period of effort in the first couple of years of the Trump administration, but I'm hard-pressed to see that it will upend great power relations on that channel. On China, there I think the unpredictability and the uncertainty is more worrying. The Chinese leadership has had a habit of testing new presidents with incidents, trying to probe how they'll react to confrontations, small military confrontations, just little tests like pop quizzes you used to have in school. And presidents have to adjust, find equilibrium, and then move on from there. I'm not sure that Trump is an American president that the Chinese have ever had to work with before. He does seem to have thrown them off balance, taking the call from Taiwan, tweeting out angrily when they took this automated submarine out of the ocean. And I'm concerned about the first year, both mutual provocation and if North Korea were to test an anti-ballistic missile that had range to reach the west coast of the United States. I mean, this is a set of issues that seems to me much more combustible than anything that would arise out of the relationship with Russia. I hope I'm wrong, but that's what I'm nervous about.
Nitin, going by what Steve has said, a tough American line on China. What is the impact on India?
Yeah. See, I think that the Chinese government under Xi Jinping has literally gone out in the last few years flexing muscles, right? The old Deng Xiaoping statement that, lie low, keep your strengths hidden, and then let the economy take over, gather power, you don't have to confront people, has been thrown out of the window. And Xi Jinping has literally picked a fight with almost all of China's big neighbors. So China has a bad relationship with Vietnam, with Japan, with Korea, with Singapore, with India, of course, and even with parts of Myanmar. So China has very few friends or pro-Chinese big powers in this part of the world. The Chinese government, as Steve said, is likely to test the US president. But the Chinese have a very strong sense of their own history. I think they see that for the first time in centuries, they are in a situation where China is on a path to achieve its rightful place in the world. So they're not going to jeopardize this by trying to fight a direct war. So it's going to be an attempt to test the US president, probably play a game of chicken. But if it comes to that, they are going to chicken out because they don't want to get into a fight. They know very acutely that they can bully the Vietnamese, they can bully the Philippines, they can bully the Singaporeans, but they can't get into a real fighting match with the United States even in a limited kind of a skirmish, because they'll be shown their weaknesses will be exposed. So, and they're acutely aware of that. That's why when they try to finger the Americans recently, they went after a small, remotely operated vehicle, not any naval craft of any consequence. So this dynamic is good for us because it increases the strategic value of New Delhi, of India, in foreign policy, because both the United States and China would want India to be doing things which does not jeopardize their bigger game with each other, right? So the United States would say, hey, look, why don't you be a stronger player in East Asia, contribute to the balance of power, in terms of equipment and military sales and all that, we'll be able to have a favorable view for your engagement in East Asia. The Chinese would say, look, just don't do that. We'll probably be able to work out ways to manage the tensions across our land border or in the Indian Ocean. Now, all this rests on the simple concern that the Indian government will be deft enough to take advantage of this. It's not about Modi being deft enough. It's about the whole establishment falling in line to help that. We had a recent case in Mongolia, for example, where signals were sent that if the Chinese bully Mongolia, India will step in and help, right? But Mongolia is a landlocked country, and even if you give them lines of credit, how are they going to move goods and services, right? So the Mongolians, in a way, got themselves into a little bit of a difficulty because they sort of overestimated how much New Delhi can help them. But it's about when you make these kind of commitments to countries like Mongolia, you must be very sure that you can deliver, because you make one wrong commitment and then things can go wrong.
Okay, with this, I think we can throw the floor open for questions. My request is, please be brief in your questions. Please give out your name and the organization you belong to, and state to whom is the question, whether it's to Steve or to Nitin. Let me take the privilege of asking my former colleague, Sudha, to ask the first question.
This is policy towards Iran.
Nuclear containment agreement that essentially caps Iran's nuclear program in a very complicated agreement that has a series of commitments, mutual commitments. Iran has to act in a certain sequence, and then the international community responds in kind. And that agreement is a very thick document that not very many people have read all the way through, and it has a lot of steps that are about to unfold over the next year. So the question is, what is Trump going to do about that agreement? The United States' participation is critical to its health. There's an enormous amount of momentum around the agreement, both geopolitical, because it has stabilized the problem of the Iranian nuclear program, but also economic, because so many corporations have gone in and started to strike deals in Iran. The sense in Washington is that the most likely course is death by 1,000 cuts rather than some abrupt withdrawal from the agreement. The new defense secretary had a hard experience with Iranian militias while fighting in Iraq. He has no sympathy for Iran. He's also sympathetic to the Gulf states' anxieties about Iran, and kind of has spent a lot of time in chambers with those regimes, hearing their concerns about Iran. So I think you have a cabinet that is skeptical about Iran, but not inclined to blow up the deal in the first year. And the same sentiment, I think, is prevalent in the Republican side of the Congress. But I don't imagine that the commitment to that hard bargain that the Clinton administration would have carried in to really see it through, to try to turn it into a permanent state of stability over the next 10 years. That, I don't believe, is going to be in this administration. And so I do think that in time, the kind of neglect of the agreement or the adding of little sanctions here and there is going to bring us back, I'm afraid, to engagement with where we were before the agreement was struck.
Professor Iyengar, please.
I'm
I'm
Ram Iyengar. I'm the Dean and the Director of the School of Computing at Florida International University in Miami. And I've been watching this, election very closely. So the Trump won because of the following factors. You can certainly disagree on that. One is he was able to create a fear among the voters, by sort of giving all sorts of things which may be right or wrong. That's one thing. And the other thing which, the Obama administration also, although they did very well, but I think in the latter part of the second year, they had a lot of problems. And finally, this is an important point, perhaps Steve might know it. I heard with several of
ask the question, please.
The question, yeah. So there were 29 million voters who voted for Trump, but they didn't want to reveal during the polling that they're voting for Trump. Do you have any comments on that?
I mean, I think the failure of polling in this election, especially in a state like Wisconsin, where the late polls showed Clinton up by 6 points, which is usually way outside the margin of error, even if the race tightens, still should have been her state. I think some of that failure is probably attributable to the unwillingness of Trump voters to participate in polling, not necessarily that they were embarrassed to say that they were voting for Trump, which is another theory that you'll hear people say. It's hard to prove scientifically, but I think the narrative of the election was hostility toward the establishment, and pollsters were part of the establishment. They're part of the conspiracy, and he would denounce polling whenever he was behind and brag about his numbers whenever he was ahead, but the overall story was someone calls you on the phone and tries to poll you, they're part of the system that you're rebelling against. So I think that was probably where those mistakes arose.
Yeah, please. Gentleman behind, Professor.
I'm presently a columnist, not a communist. Communism is dead, and so is the Cold War. And I think Trump, without saying it, has recognized it. I want to look at this purely from the point of view of India and ask both of you what you think is the prospect for India. I have been writing that Trump, even before the election, it was very clear that Trump was going to be good for India. He is close to Russia, so would we like to remain as we are. Russia's relationship with China, as you know, is really recent in terms of the closeness of Russia and China, and that is primarily because of Chinese investments in Russia, which can be replaced. The second is that now nobody has mentioned in this discussion that Trump has consistently argued for heavy tariffs against Chinese imports. We need that as badly as the United States and many other countries. If the US does it, to hell with the WTO, we can go and do it. And third is the other factor which nobody has again mentioned, this whole question of Islam. You may like it or you may not like it, but Islamophobia is a problem all over the world. From our point of view, Pakistan is a serious problem. Pakistan is a surrogate of China. And it helps us a great deal if Trump is anti-Islamic countries and particularly Pakistan. So I would like to ask you what you see as the prospect for India as a result of all this.
Nitin?
A foreign government or a foreign business is subsidizing the Indian consumer, it's a great thing. If the Chinese are producing low cost mobile phones and selling them below cost to India, and that allows us 1.2 billion people to have cheap mobile phones, it's a great thing. If 1.2 billion people can have cheap modems, it's a great thing. So I don't really think that raising tariffs is a good thing, even if the US does it. But I think it's a question of how do you play a situation where there is Chinese competition designed to decimate or destroy Indian industry. In places where Indian industry does not play a role, I think it's fantastic. And that's, a lot of manufacturing is not really done in India. Mobile phones, for all the kind of talk which is comes out, there is no really Indian designed mobile phone. The second thing is, in terms of Trump's complex attitude towards Islamism, Islamic radicalism, right? And Pakistan. These are all different things. He's conflated Muslims with terrorists. It works well in the US kind of a context. That kind of conflation is not going to play out the same way in India, and that's not necessarily a good thing. The second is, however hard he might be on an Islamic country, Pakistanis are extremely clever in being of great use to the United States. So I don't put it beyond the Pakistanis, for example, Nawaz Sharif, to go there, ingratiate himself with Donald Trump, touch his feet, praise his hairstyle, do whatever is necessary to show that, the Pakistan can be of great use to the United States. We'll help you screw the Muslim states, That's probably the kind of logic the Pakistanis will provide to the Americans. And the Americans are really good at biting that, because you still need bases, you still need infrastructure, you need intelligence, you need a partner in that part of the world in order to help do these things. So I would place a lot of emphasis on the genius of the Pakistani establishment. They've survived for 70 years on a particular way of living and surviving, and they're going to continue doing that. And I think between the Trump administration and the Pakistani government, I think the Pakistani government is smarter.
Steve, in addition to this question, India is being seen as moving closer to the United States compared to its one-time ally, or one-time friend, Russia. Recently, you may have seen there was this Limova agreement, last year, where India will open its bases, military bases, for the US military. So now, apart from that, recently we have entered into the howitzer gun deal with the United States. These two are being seen as, India getting closer, may not be an ally, but a close friend and a partner. This, and in addition to those questions.
Well, I don't really have much to add. I think I agree with what you say. I'm sure many of you read the transcript that the Pakistanis put out after the phone call from Trump to Nawaz. I mean, if you want to know what it's like to live in the United States and listen to the president-elect talk all day long, that's what it sounds like. I mean, that's what he says to everybody. You're amazing, you're great, I'm really looking forward to working with you. You're a dog, you're terrible, I hate you, you're my enemy. So it's a certain style of very personalized diplomacy that plays well to the Pakistani system, which is increasingly less constrained by public opinion as it gets narrower at the top. And so it does create opportunities for them to engage in a way that's familiar from history. I think on US-Indian military cooperation, I mean, from my perspective, to simplify a very complicated story, if you go back to the post-war period and the Cold War period, there was, I think, a mutual sort of swing in the quality of relations, even without defense cooperation in those days, of course, where generally democratic administrations moved closer to India and vice versa, and then Republican administrations would break that pattern and move closer to Pakistan. That fever is broken. So this is one of the bipartisan consensus issues in American foreign policy, long-term partnership with India. I mean, that's now, and I don't think the Trump administration has any interest in or any basis for breaking what is now, as you'd say in America, settled law. This partnership, as in principle, is now deeply embedded in American foreign policy thinking. The question, the mutual frustration has always been, over the last 20 years, since really Clinton and Bush, between the two of them, kind of solidified this framework in American thinking about the next 50 years, has been how do you operationalize it? And the Americans always want to go fast, and they want to get closer. And there's a sort of militarized aspect of American foreign policy that can be uncomfortable for lots of friends of the United States. And India has had to deal with that, reacted against it. The two threshold questions in, prove it to me, which is what you'd hear in the Pentagon, show me, because there was, this is operationally on the counterterrorism side, the policing side, the intelligence side. My sense is that it's already crossed a lot of those thresholds. It's not an exclusive relationship, but it's a much fuller operational relationship than it was even 5 or 10 years ago. On the military side, because it's so visible, it rebounds in Indian politics, it creates all kinds of dilemmas. The two big questions for the Americans always were, our partners buy our stuff, why don't you? and the jet deal was a big blow to the Obama administration, really made a lot of people grumpy in the foreign policy Asia community in the United States. And then the second is, what can we do together operationally? Base access, but it's more skin in the game, exercises, joint, task force kind of operations, even at the exercise level. And my sense is that, the Navy's pretty happy. Everybody would like to go faster. And I think, essentially, Trump is not likely to be disruptive. I think the relationship will continue.
Well, that's heartening. A gentleman on.
My question is this one on Obamacare. I have a large number of doctor friends in the US, and most of them, in fact, I was there in the US when the law was being passed, and I remember asking a lot of them, and all of them invariably said that it is good, that it is a good thing that is being done. But now one hears Mr. Trump saying he's going to repeal it on the first day when he comes to power. And I would like to know, there are 2 or 3 slightly different opinions. That in the beginning it was a little difficult in implementing.
We don't have much time. Your question, please.
Only thing is this: what is going to happen to Obamacare? Is he really going to repeal it? And what is the consequences of repealing something which is generally considered to be good to people?
He is going to of the repeal while they work on a replacement. If Trump and his advisors are paying attention to the people who elected them, they're going to have to be careful about how they use that 2 or 3 years to actually replace it with something that does not withdraw the very significant benefits that poor and working families, including lots of white families in the swing counties that elected Trump, enjoy under Obamacare. There are 2 aspects of that. One is you cannot be denied insurance because you're sick. Another is if you're not under the poverty line, but you still are stressed in your household income, you can receive subsidies. There was also a massive expansion of Medicaid to about half the states, and including states like Ohio that are critical to the next presidential election. And the danger the Republicans have of now finally achieving what they have been so rhetorically undisciplined about attacking Obamacare is that they now own the consequences of whatever comes next politically. And this is an unstable experiment. It was a kind of a hybrid system derived partly from Germany and Switzerland, and it was based on certain assumptions about how complicated insurance markets would work that have not played out perfectly. But overall, it has been a success. 20 million more Americans have health insurance than had health insurance before Obamacare. And if that is withdrawn, or if the terms of access to that insurance change, it's going to have real political consequences. There are so many. The last thing I'd say is the reason Obamacare is vulnerable today, even though we're the last OECD country in the world to have this struggle over a basic right of access to health care. We pay more, we get less than anybody in the world. It's a broken system. But the reason Obamacare struggled was because of the politics that gave birth to it. It's part of the illiberalism around the world, this majoritarian politics. If you get 51%, then you act as if you're a dictator. Obamacare passed without a single Republican vote. There was a belief during the long negotiation to pass it that at least a few Republicans would cross the aisle and legitimize it politically as a kind of cross-party consensus. And that's been true with expansions of the American social safety net for generations. Even during the Bush administration, when access to prescription drugs was expanded, it was done with support from both parties. So this was born as a democratic project, and it's going to die from partisan political opportunism, not because of its engineering problems. And it's a tragedy. It's a tragedy. People are going to suffer and die because of politics, not because of the failure of this system.
Yeah. Mike here, please.
An alum of the Columbia Journalism School. My question is to Steve. Would Bernie Sanders have won the election for the Democratic Party? And the second question is for both of you. Is Joe Stiglitz's view about inequality being one of the main causes of the rise of populism, it seems to have been vindicated. I'm curious to see if you agree.
Great questions. As I would expect from a graduate of the Columbia Journalism School. Yeah, I think Bernie Sanders might have created his own surprise. And he certainly was in touch with where the electorate was in a way that was much more complete than Secretary Clinton. Joe Biden certainly thinks he would have won. They both have an intuitive feel for the voters who ended up deciding the election. So anyway, counterfactual history is treacherous. And remind me the...
Joe Stiglitz's view on inequality. And
inequality in America, it's an interesting subject. I think it matters, of course, but what really matters is not the, in my opinion, looking at American history and American political history, I'm not as so sure that it's inequality per se as much as it is stagnation in the middle and in the, the real, that is, inflation-adjusted household incomes in the United States have been flat or declining for the great majority of Americans since about 1970. And that's what takes the toll. And we're still an opportunity society. Americans don't resent Donald Trump being a rich buffoon because they want to get rich and spend their money however they want to spend it. So it's not the gap, inequality per se, it's the loss of faith in the system, the loss of belief in opportunity. And this generation of Americans believes that their children, my generation of Americans believes, that their children will not live better than they did. Now that hasn't happened in the United States for an awfully long time. I said most of that generation believes that. So that's what, now this, I think Joe Stiglitz would say that inequality has created those conditions. That is, the same economic forces and policies that have generated such dramatic inequality have also led to that stagnation. Maybe it's too subtle of a distinction, but I think it's that stagnation that really matters.
Yeah,
Can you possibly?
I have a, so Shobha, I must also say good question for a person with close proximity to Takshashila. Okay, I'll just take the second one. I think inequality is overrated, right? Most of these populists who've come to power in the last decade have been giving expression to the hidden fears or even bigotry of society. They've been politically incorrect. They've been able to say, they've said things which others were unwilling to say, and which has made them more popular, and the things have gotten cottoned on, people have cottoned on to it. So I think there is this, I wouldn't call it, there is an unpleasant dimension to this populism, which people are unwilling to confront, and people are looking for all sorts of excuses like inequality, globalization, this, that, and the other. I think bigotry, hatred, fear, despair, the basic human emotions have a lot to do with why it's a global phenomenon.
Yes,
Hi, I'm Weber Watts. I'm an alumnus of the school and a journalist. Well, on my way here, I was seeing that Donald Trump had tweeted back at Meryl Streep with his favorite insult that she's overrated. And what I would like to ask is more like psychological in the sense that unlike Le Pen or Erdogan or Putin, you also have, I mean, Trump might be part of that sort of authoritarian populism, but he's also a petulant child.
Question.
And
Question.
what implications does that have for policy and serious policy or serious policy formulation?
Well, I think one implication is that it sort of normalizes Marie Le Pen. That was in France, that's what I heard recently. I mean, well, at least she's not Donald Trump. Maybe we can elect her. I mean, which is kind of a dangerous logic chain. This is, the source of the greatest anxiety, even within the Republican Party, the question of temperament. And does the temperament of an American president matter? In the pre-nuclear age, not so much. We had some pretty wacky presidents and distracted ones. But in the nuclear age, the stakes are just too high to contemplate a presidency that is, without discipline. And so I don't think he's going to stop tweeting nonsense. He's going to continue to tweet nonsense. The question is, what does he actually do in the Situation Room when he's reviewing options in a mini crisis that could escalate, here or there or the other place? And I don't know what to predict. The fact that one doesn't feel great about that scene is, the greatest source of anxiety. I saw something on Twitter today. I'm not sure if I can quote it exactly, but it captures the way journalists live on Twitter, right? So it said, Instagram, my life is a party. Snapchat, my life is a weird TV show. Facebook, my life has turned out pretty well. Twitter, we're all going to die.
Gentlemen.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Rajiv. I work for IT a day work. So that gives me about 30 minutes to an hour to find out information. So my first question to you, Nitin, is how can we get objective information today, of course, other than Deccan Herald? And the second question is to you, Steve, is the trade deficit is a small component of the entire US GDP. So will increasing taxes for Chinese imports really help the unemployment situation?
Nitin.
Well, it's not an easy answer, right? How do you get credible information, especially because you have a paucity of time and a surplus of Bayes theorem, right? You start by assigning probabilities and then you develop a reputation. That New York Times, if I read it in the New York Times or I read it in the Washington Post, I'm more or less sure that this is reliable as it gets, right? Similarly, on Twitter and on others, you look at feeds, you go into trusted sources of feeds and trust that source a lot more. More than anything else, I think right now we need the ability to reflect on pieces of news, right? And that's not happening because news is arriving at such a fast pace that there's no time to reflect on whether this makes sense or not. There was a news, somebody tweeted something, one of our ministers tweeted something yesterday saying that so much of tons of agricultural produce has been transacted online in the last 50 days, and this is the value of it, right? And people sort of retweeted that and said, wow, so many kilograms of agricultural produce at so much of lakh crores of rupees, until some guy actually divided the kilograms by the rupees and said, what is this produce that you're selling at 50,000 rupees per kilogram, right? So the reflection is important, and I think that's what you need to do.
Steve.
Employment in the United States is not at full employment, but the unemployment rate is down in the under 5%, which is pretty close to full employment in American experience. We're going to now get the one area where Trump's outlook and the Republican Party's outlook is aligned is on taxes. We're going to get a huge tax cut and a stimulus, maybe an infrastructure bill as well. And that is going to affect the American economy and the world economy, I think, more than the Twitter wars and even some elbows out confrontations on trade with China. The evidence since the election is that the president-elect is very interested in symbolic victories around factories and factory decisions, and corporations have learned that they can give symbolic victories and hope to be left alone. He literally was calling around the Fortune 50, talking to CEOs, asking them to make very specific business decisions to keep jobs in the United States. And when they did, then he would celebrate them and take credit. But these are pebbles in the ocean of the economy. What really lies ahead is probably a much overdue and possibly quite disruptive U.S. corporate tax reform, where we're going to drop our rate and a lot of ripple effects are going to unfold in the global economy, including with the dollar. So I do think we're in not just for a big stimulus and a boom, but a bumpy and disruptive ride, because a lot of these tax issues have been building up for quite a while, and the Republicans are now in a position to take out their axe and just cut right through them. So it'll take maybe a year, 18 months for that to happen, but it's going to be a big event.
Here.
Yeah, the lady here, please. Can you pass the mic here?
Institute of Journalism and New Media. I have a two-part question for Mr. Coll. What do you think will happen under President-elect Trump when it comes to press freedom in the United States and also worldwide, particularly in countries like India and Turkey? And the second question is, how detrimental do you think the election has been really on race relations in the United States?
Racist speech. It has encouraged hateful violence across the board. The fever of incidents, hate crimes across all kinds of lines of difference, has barely subsided in the time since the election. And I don't think this is out of step with American history. We shouldn't be surprised that this is unfinished business and that we've got a lot of work to do as a country. But as a setback, I think it's a severe one, mostly because of the change in what is normalized in public speech. We had a wave of hate violence after September 11th, where all kinds of people got caught up in random kind of street violence, thuggish reactions based on bias and ignorance, including Sikhs and South Asians. But this is different because that violence took place in a context where the president was inviting Muslim leaders to the White House and trying to distinguish the violence from its context. Here you have a president who is trying to conflate violence with politics and just opportunistic in his speech in ways that have real consequences, as that overrated Meryl Streep tried to say last night at the Golden Globes. On press freedom, unfortunately, the president-elect has nominated an attorney general who really doesn't believe that the press should have the privileges that it asserts under the First Amendment. And as attorney general, he's in a position to make life difficult, particularly in areas of reporting involving national security or unauthorized disclosures. The better news is that even if the Attorney General and the President want to change American constitutional ideas about press freedom and the First Amendment, they're not in a position to do as much as they might wish. The libel law is, I think, settled law, and the most interesting thing about First Amendment cases, free press, free speech, free religion cases on the Supreme Court is that that is one area where conservatives and liberal judges have united, and the conservatives see in the First Amendment an instrument of some of their own ambitions, ideological ambitions. So I don't think that we're going to see a reversal of Supreme Court jurisprudence. And most libel law is state law, so it's beyond the president's reach. But I'm worried about what the Justice Department is going to do.
Subramanian, please.
Here.
I'll come next. I'll come next. Subramanian.
I have a question. I think it relates to both of you. I'll start with the comment made by Nitin.
Subramanian is the associate editor of Deccan Herald.
Nitin mentioned that cephology or surveys that we do, statistical surveys that we do across the world, it's a science. He says it is just a glorified gossip. I'm really concerned about such a conclusion about a science. Then my question, therefore, is to Steve. I'm not very sure if media in the US got it wrong this time, because of two reasons. Whether they were reporting whether Trump should win or not, or who is, what the voters want. I have a feeling the focus was more on defeating Trump than actually reporting what is happening on the ground. To give a simple example, it was just now mentioned that he is the president that the party did not want. Even with this assertion, I have a problem, because in primaries after primaries, the party really gave him very convincing victory. Much before Clinton was elected as the candidate of Democratic Party, Donald Trump had clinched the nomination from the Republican Party. So I really want you to, on the basis of this, comment on the assertions made earlier.
Well, I mean, if you mean by the party primary voters, you're absolutely right. If I meant by the party the leadership of the party, public office holders around the country, leaders in the Senate, the Chamber of Commerce, and so on, the establishment of the Republican Party, that was seen in the past as more formidable than the Democratic Party, and much more disciplined, much more able to manage the primary season, control the primary season, and get the nominee they wanted. They did that very deliberately with Bush in 2000, and again with McCain, and again with Romney. In divisive primary seasons, somehow the party seemed to nominate the candidate it believed was electable, and they lost control of this primary to their voters. And not all those voters were Republicans. Some of them were independents who participated and so forth.
Can I just answer that thing? Very quickly, psephology is not a science, right? For anything to qualify as a science, it should be able to explain events and also predict the future. Psephology at best explains the past, but it does not predict the future. So it can't be a science.
Yeah, the girl in the back.
Yes. Good evening. My name is Akriti. I'm a producer on the BBC World News Mumbai Bureau. My question is addressed to you. Do you believe that because of the amount of free media coverage that Donald Trump received, he sort of had an edge over Clinton?
Yes, absolutely. He was, he's an amazing character. He has, great gifts, and one of them was expressed in the way that he managed to run both against the press and while being the most accessible presidential candidate to the press in my memory. I mean, this is, even when he was the nominee, even down the stretch, he would answer phone calls. He would go on television. He used the press with great alacrity, while also taking advantage of the press's unpopularity as part of his strategy for rousing his base. So he did win free media, not through a conspiracy, but because he made himself accessible. And Mrs. Clinton took a different path. I think as the front runner, she and her campaign believed that they didn't have to put up with the risks of spontaneous live interviewing and exposure to hostile questions and surprise questions, whereas he is entirely comfortable with those environments and seems to get away with saying things that past presidential candidates would have been punished for saying.
Hi, I'm Eric Savage, and I'm married to a graduate of the Columbia School of Journalism. Thank you both, Steve, and for taking the time to share your views. I'm not at all personally excited for the Trump presidency, but my question for you, Steve, is do you think there's any real probability that Trump will end up being a good or even great president?
That's not my role is to offer those forecasts. I do think that his presidency is going to be great for journalism, that's that in the old Washington Post newsrooms. That's basically how we looked at candidates. Are they good for journalism? Or are they bad for journalism? And despite the pressure that he'll put on journalistic practice, the fact that he's appointing all these unvetted cabinet officers, that he's enabling an ethical culture that is a departure from the practices of presidents of both parties in the last 15 years. The fact that you have a president and both houses of Congress controlled by the same party, all this sets up for trouble. I mean, they're going to, and you have a president who seems to enjoy engendering conflict around him, including among his advisors. So, a lot of our students at the graduate school woke up shocked, like a lot of people in Manhattan that morning, and some of them really dismayed and fearful. And we had a little town hall meeting at the school that midday after the vote, and on the faculty, we were all run to the sound of gunfire. This is the time when the country needs you. Go down to Washington, start reporting, because you're not going to have an opposition in Congress that is going to be empowered the way it can be when one party controls that chamber. And it's going to be an atmosphere of intimidation. Sources are going to need professional reporting to protect them, to get the word out about what is happening. And one of our colleagues on the faculty had attended the journalism school and graduated, I guess, in the spring of 1973. And he told the students, in November 1972, Richard Nixon was reelected, and I was pretty disappointed with that result as a citizen. And then 2 years later, he resigned because of the reporting of a couple of kid reporters at the Washington Post. So get out there. This is the time for us to do our work.
Gentleman over there.
Government's stand is going to be on environment, climate change, and specifically on the Endangered Species Act. I mean, I don't know if Steve is aware of the Endangered Species Act, but it's a huge support to global wildlife conservation. So what do you think his stand is going to be on this act?
General from Oklahoma who is, has a really skeptical to hostile view of the EPA's work, and the EPA is critical to the commitments the United States made in Paris, which I expect the Trump administration to reverse by attacking the Clean Power Plan that the Obama administration has put in place. They can't pull it right away, but I'm sure they're going to be committed to undermining it. You have in the Secretary of State, the chief executive of an oil and gas corporation that has, has a pretty miserable record on climate issues. He has a rhetorical position that is more neutral, but I don't see this being a priority. I think, the question that the pragmatists in the Trump administration will confront on the global stage is the cost of essentially walking away from Paris or trying to blow up Paris or create an environment where other countries whose commitments may be weak or politically coerced also back away from them. Certainly it would lead to isolation more than any kind of great achievement for the United States diplomatically, and especially in Europe. This skepticism about climate change and its consequences that you find as a routine part of political debate in the United States. We're, again, the only country in the world where this is not settled politics, except maybe Australia, which also has a kind of debate about this. But I don't see that changing during the Trump administration. I think what Nitin said is right. He means what he says, and what he says about climate is that he doesn't believe the science.
Lady, please be very brief. We have very few minutes left.
Yes. My name is Padma Ramchandran. I'm a retired civil servant from Kerala. We heard so many scandals about Trump and women just a few days before the election date. What happened? It didn't bother the men, and I think it didn't bother many of the women also.
Yeah, I mean, it's a terrible testament to the degradation of popular discourse and gender relations in the United States that he paid no price for those remarks. I mean, he essentially said that he bragged about committing sexual assault. He was called out on it. His poll numbers tanked for a week. His defense was, I didn't really mean it. It's just locker room talk. This goes on all the time. And somehow that and all of the other things that he said and owned about women from the very beginning of the primary campaign did not have political consequences. And I cannot explain that. I just don't understand when our society has made so much progress in the workplace in creating an environment of cross-gender understanding about what the rules are, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, and where women are rising. There are more women graduating from college in the United States than men. Women are flooding into the professions. They're 70% of our student body. They're going to be leading the United States in all kinds of new ways over the next 30 or 40 years. And how we could have a setback of this character, it's as discouraging as the racial backlash, the white backlash vote, and it doesn't get as much airtime because it was somehow it just boggles my mind as a father of daughters and lots of other. This is not a Manhattan West Coast problem. This is an American problem, and how this discourse is going to recover and right itself is, I think, one of the big challenges for the country over the next 4 years.
Chengappa.
Professor Chengappa, Christ University, Bangalore. In the light, my question is directed to both the speakers here. Thank you. In the light of Russia-Pakistan relations warming up and the South Asian strategic environment undergoing a change, do you think the Trump presidency will give it a further push in that direction? Thank you.
No, if anything, I think it's going to be the opposite, because the closer, I mean, even it could be in the short term, the closer the US and Russia get, or let's not call it closer, the less antagonistic the US and Russia get, the more likely India would be a beneficiary of that, because we have very good relations with both of them. So I don't think, and anyway, the Pakistan factor is just way too overrated. I mean, to the entire Indian strategic conceptualization, the strategic future, Pakistan is just so overrated. It's at best a distraction, at worst predilection of prime ministers who think that doing something with Pakistan is a great thing. It just doesn't matter. I don't see, at least in Bangalore, none of us seem to be concerned about Pakistan other than something which you read in the news somewhere.
Yeah. There was a question there. Yeah.
Good evening. I am Narendra, General Manager of Gujarat Rural and Urban Housing, a subsidiary of HDFC. My question is to Mr. Steve and Mr. Nitin. How does Trump relationship with the Federal Reserve and LL pan out, because that is very critical because of the interest rates and its impact on India? Or will they have to bear like how we bore with Mr. Rajan till February 3, 2018, when LL's tenure will lapse?
Yeah, I mean, I think he brought his loose talk to the Fed during the election campaign, but then once he won, he quieted down. He's nominated a Treasury Secretary who doesn't have traditional macroeconomic experience. He may be a successful businessman. He was a banker and a trader, I think, at Goldman for a while. Normally when bankers come down to Washington, it's because they've had broad macroeconomic experience. The guy who's coming apparently from Goldman Sachs to be the chief economic advisor, Gary Cohn, he's of that type, more of a global macroeconomic banker. So you're going to have a mix of perspectives about the Fed when it comes time to nominate, identify a successor. I think the big question is going to be what's this unexpected stimulus going to do to inflation in the United States and worldwide. It's already, knocked U.S. interest rates up, 50 basis points or so, I guess. I saw a hilarious headline in the FT the other day. Raging inflation in Europe causes, European Central Bank to worry, and it's because it was like 0.5%. So it would take a lot of stimulus to really change the equation at the Fed, but I do think whatever tax reform or infrastructure thing happens this year, by 2018, we're going to be in a different political economy than we've been in for a while, and it may have lots of surprises.
Well, we have to come to an end. This discussion ends here, but Steve and Nitin will both be here, and you can, whoever who couldn't ask the questions, they can certainly ask them over cocktails and dinner. I thank both of you for a very illuminating discussion, and the audience for excellent questions. Thank you. Piyali.
Thank you, gentlemen, for that insightful discussion. I would now request Mr. Nikhil Kanikal of the Printers Mysore Private Limited to come on stage and give the vote of thanks.
Thanks, Pierre. On behalf of the Printers Mysore, the publishers of the Deccan Herald and Prajavani newspapers and Sudha and Mayura magazines, we'd like to offer our sincerest thanks to the speakers and to Mr. B.S. Arun for sharing their perspectives on clearly what is a very trending topic. I think we've had lots of food for thought. We'd like to thank Columbia University, Columbia Alumni Association, and especially Phyllis, and the Columbia Journalism School for participating and associating with us. We'd like to thank Takshila Institution and Nitin for sharing your views, Nitin, today. I'd like to also thank our team at the Deccan Herald for putting this up, and thank you all for coming tonight. Please join us for drinks and dinner. I'm sorry, we've forgotten a bit of the formalities. I'd like to ask the editor of Deccan Herald, Mr. Tilak Kumar, to please present Mr. Steve Coll with a small token of our appreciation. Thank you. And I'd like to ask Mr. Shant Kumar, the editor of Prajavani, to please present Nitin with a token of our appreciation. And can I call Mr. Subramanya, the associate editor, to also recognize his colleague on stage, please. Mr. Arun. Thank you all once again. Please have a good night.